Oliver is a Great Western engine. He was found by Douglas escaping from scrap with his brake van towed. With the help of his driver and fireman, Douglas brought Oliver and Toad to the safety of Sir Topham Hatt's railway. Here, they were mended, and Oliver was painted in splendid Great Western green. All the engines were glad of the extra help Oliver could offer. Now he helped Duck to run his branch line on Sir Topham Hatt's railway. One day, while Oliver was waiting at the station, which the other engine shared with the small railway, he noticed a metal cage hanging outside the station master's house. Inside the cage fluttered a brightly colored creature. "It's blue and green," he told Duck in the shed that night, "and it's got a yellow pointed nose, with a sort of funnel thing on top of its head. My driver says that it talks," he added doubtfully. "Talks?" scoffed Duck. "Why doesn't it ask to come out of its cage then?" Duck's driver overheard them. "It's a parrot," he laughed. "Your driver was quite right, Oliver. Some parrots can talk, and this is one of them. It belongs to the station master's father. The old man was a sailor who brought the parrot from foreign parts. The parrot's name was Cocky. He was only put outside on fine days, of course, but he quickly became a favorite with the railway staff. He didn't seem to mind the sudden noises that the engines made either." Duck and Oliver listened carefully whenever they had the chance, but try as they might, they never heard Cocky say a single word. "I don't believe he can talk," Duck said to Oliver one night. "All that silly bird does is shriek and flap about." Duck was cross because Oliver had been teasing him about the time when Donald's driver and fireman had once put a duck egg under Duck's bunker. Birds just meant trouble as far as Duck was concerned. A few days later, Oliver was waiting for the last train on the small railway. It was late, and Oliver was becoming impatient. When it did arrive at last, the passengers quickly got into Oliver's coaches. Oliver waited for the conductor to blow his whistle and wave his green flag. Soon the whistle sounded, but the platform was empty except for Cocky, fluttering in his cage. "The conductor must be in his van already," the driver said. "Away we go, Oliver. Let's see if we can make up for some of the lost time." They had a good run, but when they reached the big station, the conductor came up to Oliver. He was cross. "Whatever were you up to, rushing off like that, Oliver?" he demanded. "Next time, wait for my whistle before you start, please. You might have caused an accident." Oliver looked puzzled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Conductor," he said, "but there was a whistle." "He's right," agreed his driver. "We all heard it." Now the conductor was puzzled too. "But I was in my van when you started," he said. "I was stacking some boxes, and you made them fall over when you dashed off like that." Suddenly, a grin spread across the fireman's face. "It's that Cocky!" he exclaimed. "That clever bird must have learned how to imitate the guard's whistle." They soon found out he was right. "Well, well," chuckled Duck knowingly when he heard about the confusion. "Fancy getting fooled by a bird, eh, Oliver? With my egg and your parrot, I think that makes us even, don't you?"
Skarloey is a little old engine with a tall black funnel and a cheeky smile. He works with his friend Rheneas on the little railway that takes passengers up to the high hills of Sodor to see the lakes and waterfalls. He is always eager to work and help his forgetful driver. Skarloey remembers a time when he arrived at a station with cleaning brushes leaning against his boiler because his driver had forgotten to remove them. He even left 2 socks to dry on Skarloey's buffers once, and the poor old engine was teased by the others. "Look at his buffer mitts," scoffed Sir Handel. When it was Skarloey's turn to take passengers to the vicarage fair, he arrived rather late. Skarloey felt impatient. He was steamed up and ready to go, but his driver made him wait. He had lost his tea mug and was looking everywhere for it. "Oh, never mind, Skarloey," he said at last. "We mustn't be late." When they arrived at the vicarage, Skarloey felt hot and bothered because he had rushed to make up time, and his driver felt parched because he'd had no tea. Skarloey looked forward to lunchtime when he could sit in a siding and let off steam, but things got worse. His driver's sandwiches went missing. "I put them up there," he said to the conductor, pointing toward the cab. Skarloey groaned with dismay. Skarloey was tired when he returned to the shed that night. He was ready for a good night's rest, but the driver had forgotten something else. "Where is my flashlight?" he sighed. "Never mind that now," Skarloey grumbled. "Just open the shed, drop my fire, and let me go to sleep." Skarloey rolled into the shed, and quickly fell asleep after the driver and fireman had left for home. But he wasn't asleep for long. He woke with a start to hear loud rustling noises beneath him. He couldn't call to anyone because he had no steam, so he shut his eyes tight and waited for morning. When his driver and fireman arrived to start work, he told them all about it. "With all these noises and all my belongings going missing, I'm starting to think something's wrong," said the driver. "I'm going to speak to the station master." The station master confirmed that none of the driver's belongings had been handed into the lost and found, but he did advise the driver that there had been reports of a burglary at Croven's Gate, so everyone had to be vigilant. "I'll ask a policeman to pop around later," said the station master. That evening, as Skarloey was taking on water, Officer Penston arrived with his notebook. "I'll keep an eye on your shed tonight," he told Skarloey's driver. "We'll soon solve this mystery." Skarloey was shut up in the shed again, but he felt safer with Officer Penston around. But no sooner had everything gone still than the rustling sounds began again. Skarloey felt scared. The next morning he told Officer Penston what he had heard. "There was no sign of anyone coming in or out," he told Skarloey, "but we'll take a look all the same." Officer Penston and the driver investigated the engine shed. They didn't find a thief, but they did discover a tea mug in a toolbox. "Oh, I put it there while I mended Skarloey's footplate," the driver laughed. They soon found the flashlight beside the telephone. "That's right, I needed to see the phone book at night," he recalled. And a trail of sandwich crumbs, which they followed to a pile of leaves and paper shreds in the corner of the shed. Underneath was a sleeping hedgehog, her babies, and the remains of the driver's sandwiches. "Oh dear," laughed the driver. "I put my bag of sandwiches on the floor while I spoke to firemen yesterday." He bent down and smiled at the little hedgehog family. "You're quite welcome to them." Skarloey didn't mind sharing his shed with a hedgehog, and wasn't afraid any more. It wasn't long before Sir Topham had arrived, with a locker for Skarloey's driver to keep his belongings safe, and a saucer of milk for Skarloey's hedgehog.
Percy has lots of jobs along Thomas's branch line, but one of his favorites is pulling the mail train. Every morning he picks up the mail bags from Farquhar and then takes them along the main line to the big station at Tidmouth, where there is a big office for sorting the letters and parcels. Sometimes Percy would take the mail to the junction, where one of the big engines would take his mail vans over to the mainland on their trains. It's a very important job, and the mail train must always run on time, no matter what. One day, when he returned home from the harbor, Percy didn't feel well at all. "Your injector has failed," groaned his driver. "What a time to do it, too. Tom Tipper will be here soon with his mail delivery." "There must be another engine who can take the mail, surely?" asked Percy anxiously. "I don't know," said the station master. "Thomas is busy today, and Daisy has just left for the junction. If only—" Just then, they all heard a familiar ding-ding of a bell. Then Toby arrived from the quarry with Henrietta. "Toby, just in time," said the station master. Once he understood the situation, Toby was happy to help. "Are you sure you'll be fast enough, Toby?" asked Henrietta. "You can't risk missing James's connection." "There's no choice," said Toby. "The station master needs another engine, and I'm it. Don't worry, I'll get there in time." Soon, Tom Tipper arrived in his mail van, and the men set to work to load the sacks of mail into the vans. When they were ready, Percy wished him good luck as Toby puffed away. We'll get there, said Toby confidently. They started out well, but as they passed through the tunnel, they saw someone standing by a lonely cottage waving a red flag. "That's Mrs. Kindly," said the driver. "I wonder what's wrong." Toby pulled up carefully, and the fireman went up the steps to meet Mrs. Kindly at her door. "Is something the matter?" he asked. "Yes, there is," said Mrs. Kindly. "I'm sorry to hold you up like this, but I've written a birthday card for my sister, and I wasn't able to get it to the post box in time. Could you perhaps drop it off for me, please?" The fireman didn't know what to think. "Well, it's a good thing you stopped us then," he said. "We happen to be pulling the mail train today. We'll get your letter delivered, no problem." "Oh, thank you. That's very kind." "What a time to make a request stop," cried the driver when the fireman returned. "Still, we did promise after all. Let's try to make up lost time." So Toby set off again. Luckily, the journey was mostly downhill, so he didn't have to use too much steam. But he still had to stop halfway to allow Daisy a clear run back up the line. By now, Toby was starting to feel tired. "Come on, come on, come on," he puffed. "I'm too old to dash about like this." But at last, they reached the junction just as James was pulling in. He was surprised to see Toby. "Well, that makes a change anyway," remarked James once he heard about Percy. "I wouldn't have hurried, though, if I knew that I was getting snail mail." Toby didn't mind. As soon as James had gone, he had a long drink at the water column and then went slowly home. A few days later, Mrs. Kindly wrote another letter. This one she sent to Farquhar, thanking Toby, his driver, and his fireman for being so kind in delivering her sister's birthday card on time. Toby felt pleased at being able to help, and while he agrees that the mail must go through, he'd secretly prefer it to be delivered by someone else.
There was a buzz of excitement on the railway. Sir Topham Hatt had announced that a well-known writer was coming to finish his book about famous steam engines and their journeys. Gordon and Sir Handel were being cleaned for his arrival. "I must look my best for my interview," boasted Gordon. "Obviously only engines with titles will make an impression," steamed Sir Handel grandly. "I've got a title. I'm a Sir." Percy brought Gordon's coaches. "What's an impression?" he asked. "It's when you are important," Sir Handel explained loftily, "and everyone remembers you." "Like that time Gordon was asked to take that special?" puffed Percy brightly. "Yes, indeed," smiled Gordon loftily. "And ran into a ditch to avoid it?" finished Percy. "Oh, I remember that one!" And he ran off laughing. The writer sailed into the wharf one bright autumn morning. Duncan was there to greet him with Sir Topham Hatt, and it was agreed that the writer could travel in Duncan's cab to the junction. Duncan was excited. Carrying the writer made him feel important. He was so pleased that he rocked and bounced all the way along the line. The writer didn't enjoy it at all. And when they arrived at the junction, he had to go and sit in Sir Topham Hatt's office to recover. "I certainly made an impression," Duncan boasted to the other engines. "Well, he'll certainly remember you," Sir Handel sniggered, "for all the wrong reasons." That afternoon, Gordon arrived at the junction to take the writer along the main line, so he could take note of the journey for his book. Gordon was so full of steam that he raced along the line, missing 3 stations. The writer wasn't impressed. "The journey was a complete blur," he complained. "Gordon went so fast I couldn't see anything." Gordon took this as a compliment and boasted to the little engines. Sir Handel was determined to be the best of all. The writer seemed relieved when he came to take him on a tour of the little railway. "This seems like a sensible engine," he remarked to the guard. Sir Handel overheard and proudly let off steam as he waited by the platform. This blew the writer's manuscript everywhere. Papers scattered all over the place, landing in a terrible muddle. "I don't think he'll forget me," Sir Handel told the others in the shed that night. The next day, a storm blew up, and strong winds caused damage on the Island of Sodor. Trees fell on many of the lines and across some of the roads. The writer was worried. He had to get his manuscript to the printers on the other side of the island. Today was the deadline, but the road was blocked. He telephoned Sir Topham Hatt and explained.
"I know a route,"
said Sir Topham Hatt.
"It runs by the coast. Percy is in the works yard. Go and see him at once."
The works manager soon found Percy and told him the news. Percy was frightened of the strong winds, but he wanted to help. He puffed carefully along the wind-swept line. And Percy tried to keep steady, whilst the wind whistled around his small wheels. last, they arrived safely at the printers, and the writer delivered his manuscript. He was very pleased with Percy, and asked if he could take his photograph. Percy was delighted. Many months later, Sir Topham Hatt gathered the engines together. He had a big box of books, and was handing them out to his staff. The contents were not what they had expected. He was very rude about engines like Duncan, Sir Handel, and Gordon, but on the front page was a picture of Percy, as a fine example of a little four-wheeled saddle tank engine.
In the summer, Tidmouth plays host to the annual pony show, Thejumukhana. Sir Topham Hatt came to see Edward about the arrangements for the show. "I'd like you to collect the equipment for the Thejumukhana from Grosvenor Gate," he told Edward. "I'd be glad to, sir," Edward said happily, and steamed off at once. Sir Handel was not best pleased to be taking freight cars. "Silly things," he grumbled. "Why can't Peter Sam do it?" "Sir Topham Hatt wants you to collect the equipment," the driver told him firmly. "Not Peter Sam." Edward arrived and began telling Sir Handel exactly what he'd need for the Thejumukhana. But Sir Handel was so flustered and cross that he didn't want to listen. "We'll need poles, cones, and—" "I know what to do, Edward," Sir Handel interrupted, and he fussed out of the station before Edward could finish. The lady delivering the equipment for the Thejumukhana was supposed to meet Sir Handel at the station close to the riding school, but she was running late, and wasn't there when Sir Handel arrived. "Must be further on," he thought. So, Sir Handel passed through the station near the riding school and puffed into the wharf instead. There, he found a group of men standing with a great pile of boxes between the rails and the quayside. "Peep, peep! I've come to collect the things for the show," Sir Handel blustered. "Please load them quickly." The men were confused. "We thought this lot was going by boat," they murmured to each other. But they did as they were asked, and loaded the freight cars quickly with the mysterious load. And, before long, Sir Handel was bustling back to Grosvenor Gate to meet Edward and transfer the goods. Edward returned to Tidmouth, and the boxes were taken to the Thejumukhana field for the show. But it wasn't long before Sir Topham Hatt's telephone rang.
"What use are potted plants for show jumping?"
shouted the organizer of the Thejumukhana. No sooner had he promised to look into the problem, than it rang again.
"Our prized potted plants didn't arrive at the flower show on the mainland,"
sighed the owner of the garden center.
"Do you know what's happened to them?"
Sir Topham Hatt sighed. "I think I might have a rough idea." When Edward heard what had happened, he went to find Sir Handel at once. "You've been very careless. You've picked up the wrong delivery." Sir Handel was confused. "It's you who got it wrong. They weren't at the station at all. They were at the wharf." "They were at the station by the riding school," said the station master. "And they still are, Sir Handel. You were so impatient you didn't stop in the right place. The potted plants went to the Thejumukhana by mistake."
Sir Topham Hatt will speak to you later.
Oh dear, spluttered Sir Handel. What will we do now?
There's no time to collect the equipment and deliver it in time for the show now, sighed Edward. They'll miss the start of the show. But I think I know what to do. He hurried off back to Tidmouth and found Sir Topham Hatt and the organizer of the Thejumukhana arguing on the platform. Edward blew his whistle and they both stopped to look at him. I think I might have a solution, he told them, and explained his plan. The Thejumukhana organizer listened and agreed it would work. Soon, the children arrived with their ponies and were amazed when they saw the colorful show ring. Pretty potted plants stood in rows with garden rakes above them to make show jumps, and pots of conifer bushes were laid out to play Thejumukhana games. The Sodor Times newspaper came to take photos, and the day was a great success. When it was over, the owner of the garden center presented the children with rosettes and prizes. Stephen and Bridget, Sir Topham Hatt's grandchildren, helped the garden center owner to set up a stall so he could sell his plants. Everything was sold, except for one bush, which was eaten by a hungry pony. The organizer of the Thejumukhana thanked Sir Topham Hatt. "This has been a day to remember," she laughed. The owner of the garden center thanked him too. "I have sold more plants today than I ever would have at the flower show on the mainland." Then Sir Topham Hatt thanked Edward. "You have been a really useful engine," he smiled. "And to think," Edward chuckled, "it was only because Sir Handel was a really careless one."
It was a cold January morning on the Island of Sodor. The Scottish engines, Donald, Douglas, and Duncan, were working together in the works yard. "Och, it's as chilly as the Scottish Highlands today," shouted Donald. "Aye, it'll be snowing soon," agreed Duncan. "Well, the hard work shunting here should keep us warm," said Douglas, and began marshalling some freight cars around the yard. "Come on, lads. Let's get the work finished before Burns Night." Burns Night is a Scottish occasion which celebrates the life of the poet Robert Burns. The Scottish engines hadn't heard his name for a long time, and it made them feel homesick. That day, as they worked, they told the other engines about Scotland. When Percy brought empty freight cars to the station, Douglas told him about the hills and glens he used to run through. When Henry came to take some freight cars to the scrapyard, Duncan told him about bagpipe music. And when Peter Sam came to help, Donald told him about the Loch Ness Monster. "She lives under the water and pops her head out every now and again." "Oh dear," shivered Peter Sam. He didn't like monsters at all. "Is the Loch Ness Monster as big as Gordon?" "Ach nah," laughed Donald. "She's about as big as 100 Gordons." "Oh no!" Peter Sam squealed and raced back to hide in the shed. That evening, Sir Topham Hatt came to see Peter Sam. He had an important job for him. "I want you to go to the wharf and collect something special," he told Peter Sam. "It's to be freezing fog tonight," Sir Topham Hatt advised. "You'll need a lamp." After hearing about the Loch Ness Monster, Peter Sam wasn't sure he wanted to leave the shed, but he didn't want to let Sir Topham Hatt down. "Yes, sir," he said nervously, and puffed into the cold night with his coaches and freight cars. The men at the wharf loaded his train quickly, and Peter Sam set off back to the junction. was thick, and he could barely see ahead of him. Steady we go, he puffed bravely to himself. Soon they reached the lake loop line, where Peter Sam was to turn around his train. Peter Sam stopped. He was terrified. The lake was very dark. He began to think about what Donald had said about the Loch Ness Monster. What if there's a monster here too? He whimpered. He tried to pretend he was safe in his shed, but an eerie noise made Peter Sam jump. He put on full steam and raced back down the line. As he hurried around the lake, he heard 3 loud splashes in the water. Oh my! Oh! Donald, Douglas, and Duncan were waiting in the yard when Peter Sam came rushing in. I saw it! He squealed to Donald. Saw what? Asked Donald. The monster! Peter Sam shivered with nerves. It made a strange sound. All of a sudden, Peter Sam heard the sound again, coming closer and closer. Donald, Douglas, and Duncan laughed and laughed. They knew exactly what it was. A man stopped beside Peter Sam, carrying a set of bagpipes. Sorry, didn't mean to alarm ye. Was cheering it up there. Your train's full of things for the Burns night supper at the town hall, Duncan explained. Peter Sam was surprised to find people in traditional Scottish dress walking up and down the platform, and workmen lifted boxes of small round objects out of his freight cars and toward the town hall. That's the haggis, said Peter Sam's driver. When you rushed around the lake, some of them flew out and into the lake. That's what made the splash. Peter Sam was very glad to know there was no monster in the lake after all. At last the Burns night came, and the Injuns had some surprise visitors. The Scottish dancers and pipers brought some delicious food from the Burns night supper, and the pipers played a tune especially for the Scottish Injuns. Isn't that quite home? They said to each other. But it's lovely, hard to say.
distance may sadden our hearts. Wherever we stray,